In the vast theater of global power, a silent storm brews. From the bustling markets of Shanghai to the corridors of Washington, a new chapter of economic warfare unfolds, not with missiles or armies, but with currency and cunning. This is the story of how a nation once underestimated began weaving an intricate web, a financial trap that could reshape the balance of the modern world. As America holds tightly to its dollar, China plays a different game, one of patience, precision, and profound strategy. Welcome to China's revenge plan, the dollar trap. In the quiet unfolding of modern history, there exists a force not born of conquest or conflict, but of design. China's unseen evolution of economic strategy did not erupt overnight. It emerged from decades of observation, patience, and the relentless study of global systems, like a river carving its path through stone. This strategy was slow, deliberate, and unyielding. China watched as the world bent to the will of the American dollar, how the green note became the invisible chain that bound nations, dictated markets, and controlled destinies. It studied not the might of armies, but the rhythm of economies, the pulse of trade, and the psychology of dependence. The realization came not as a spark, but as a revelation. True dominance in the modern era would not be built on battlefields, but in boardrooms, not with soldiers, but with systems. The foundations were laid quietly, behind the FIFI day of rapid industrialization and global integration. Every factory built, every foreign investment invited, every infrastructure project launched was a piece of a greater puzzle. What appeared to be China's race to modernize was, in truth, a meticulous alignment of power, economic, technological, and ideological. The West, celebrating its role in shaping China's rise, failed to notice that the student was rewriting the very rules of the classroom. As nations opened their markets and corporations flocked to its shores, China built not only products but partnerships, not only exports but influence. Its strategy was not to overthrow the dollar overnight, but to make the world quietly question its dependence on it. While America wielded the dollar as a weapon of control, sanctioning, isolating, and dictating, China observed its overreach. It understood that every nation weary of economic coercion would one day seek an alternative, a system free from the dominance of a single currency. And so began the Great Repositioning. Through massive infrastructure projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, China began to weave a new financial network, one that would slowly rival the Western-led order. Each loan, each investment, each trade agreement was a strand in a growing web that stretched from Asia to Africa, from Europe to South America. It was not conquest by force, but by finance. This unseen evolution also extended inward. China knew that before challenging the dollar abroad, it had to strengthen itself within. It cultivated technological independence, built its digital economy, and amassed reserves of gold and foreign assets. It became a producer of everything the world needed, ensuring that its economy was too entangled with the global system to be easily isolated. It developed institutions, payment systems, and alliances designed to reduce its vulnerability to dollar-denominated threats. It learned to navigate the storms of global markets, not as a passenger, but as a captain charting new waters. Every move was calculated, every delay purposeful. Even its apparent compliance with global norms was strategic, a cloak that concealed its growing autonomy. When America believed it held economic supremacy, China was quietly mapping out a parallel world, one where power was measured not in bombs or banks, but in balance sheets and bytes. The nation's leadership thought not in election cycles, but in generations. Its planners envisioned a future where influence would flow like water, soft, invisible, yet impossible to stop. What the world mistook for cooperation was, in truth, calibration. Each engagement with the West provided data, insight, and experience that would later fuel independence. This was China's greatest strength: the art of appearing patient while moving with precision, the wisdom to lose small battles to win the larger war. The unseen evolution was not about immediate victory, it was about inevitability. The transformation was gradual enough to seem harmless, yet profound enough to change the course of the global economy forever. In this grand design, China positioned itself not merely as a participant in the system, but as its silent architect, crafting the blueprints of a new order beneath the surface of the old one. America's financial dominance was not built overnight. It emerged from the ashes of war, forged in the confidence of a nation that believed its dollar would forever define the rhythm of global exchange. For decades, the greenback was more than currency. It was the language of power, the instrument through which empires traded, debts were settled, and economies were stabilized. Nations trusted it as they trusted gravity, believing it to be an unshakable constant in an unpredictable world. But beneath the brilliance of this success lay the seeds of fragility. The very foundation of America's dominance, the global demand for its dollar, became its greatest vulnerability. It created an illusion of endless strength, a system that rewarded excess and punished restraint. As America printed more money to fuel consumption, wars, and debt, the dollar's dominance transformed into a subtle trap. The country began to rely on the world's dependence rather than its own discipline. Factories closed as production shifted overseas, leaving behind hollowed industries and inflated confidence. The American consumer became the engine of global demand. But the machinery that once built its wealth was now scattered across the globe, many of its parts manufactured in China. The irony was profound. The very system that gave America control also created the conditions for its decline. Its strength turned inward, consuming itself like fire that forgets the forest it burns. China understood this paradox long before the world did. It saw that America's financial supremacy depended not on productivity, but on faith. Faith that the dollar would always hold value, faith that nations would always trade in it, faith that no alternative could exist. It was a faith that could be eroded not by war, but by doubt. And so China began to play a longer, quieter game. It accumulated trillions in U.S. debt, not as an act of submission, but as a means of leverage. It held the very currency that controlled the world, understanding that one day the balance could shift not through confrontation, but through confidence lost. Every time America weaponized its currency, sanctioning rivals, freezing assets, or isolating nations, it exposed its own weakness. It revealed to the world that the dollar was not neutral, it was a tool of control, and control, once resented, breeds rebellion. Countries began to seek alternatives, trading in local currencies, exploring digital systems, and aligning themselves with China's vision of a world where no single nation could dictate the rules. America's dominance had become its dependency. To maintain power, it had to ensure global trust. But with every economic crisis, every financial bailout, and every political divide, that trust eroded further. The empire of the dollar had one fatal flaw. It encouraged complacency. As America borrowed against the future, it exported its manufacturing, innovation, and resilience. It became a nation of consumers supported by credit, its economy increasingly detached from the realities of production. China, meanwhile, was building factories, infrastructure, and influence. It turned America's appetite into its advantage, feeding the very dependency that hollowed out its rival. The trade imbalance was not merely economic, it was strategic. For every dollar America spent, China gained another brick in its foundation of global power. The world began to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Central banks diversified their reserves. Nations once bound by the dollar's dominance started settling trade through new arrangements, often led by Beijing's hand. The cracks were small at first, but like fault lines beneath the surface, they were spreading. America's strength, once unquestionable, began to look overstretched. The illusion of infinite control was fading. The dollar, once a symbol of unity and stability, was becoming a reminder of imbalance and overreach. In this quiet transformation, China saw its opportunity not to destroy the dollar, but to let it collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The birth of the digital yuan was not merely a technological achievement, but a declaration of intent. In the age where data is the new oil and algorithms the new armies, China understood that control over currency meant control over the future. The creation of the digital yuan was the culmination of years of experimentation, research, and quiet preparation. A step toward freeing global trade from the shadow of the dollar. It was not designed just to modernize payments, but to redefine the very architecture of money itself. While the rest of the world debated the implications of cryptocurrencies and digital finance, China was already building the infrastructure for a new monetary era, one where sovereignty extended into cyberspace. Unlike decentralized cryptocurrencies that threatened governments, the digital yuan strengthened the state. It was a digital currency backed by the People's Bank of China, a blend of innovation and authority. Every transaction could be tracked, every exchange recorded, every movement of capital made visible to the architects of its economy. For China, transparency was not a risk, it was a weapon. It allowed the state to monitor spending, curb corruption, and enhance economic precision. But beyond domestic governance, the digital yuan carried a far grander ambition. It was a tool of diplomacy, a bridge for global trade, that bypassed Western-controlled financial systems. In the hands of a strategic power, digital currency became not just money, but influence. The implications rippled quietly across the world. For decades, the US dollar had dominated digital transactions through systems like SWIFT, giving America the ability to monitor and control global flows of money. Every transfer, every sanction, every embargo relied on that network of dependency. The digital yuan offered an alternative, a parallel system that could operate outside American oversight. It allowed nations weary of sanctions to trade freely, corporations to bypass restrictions, and economies to build resilience against the dollar's reach. For China, this was the beginning of a silent rebellion, not through confrontation, but through innovation. The digital yuan was the blueprint for economic autonomy, wrapped in the language of progress. The rollout began within China's borders. seamlessly integrated into daily life. From street vendors to major corporations, the adoption spread with astonishing speed. It wasn't forced. It was woven into convenience. Every scan, every purchase, every digital transaction was part of a larger experiment. The digitization of an entire economy. And while the world marveled at China's efficiency, few realized the magnitude of what was being tested. This was not just about payments. It was about power real, time control over money supply, data-driven policy execution, and economic adaptability on a scale never before seen. The digital yuan allowed the state to react instantly to inflation, stimulate sectors, or restrict flows, all with the precision of code. Then came the global expansion through Belt and Road partnerships. China began offering its digital payment systems to developing nations, embedding its currency into their infrastructure. These countries, eager for modernization, welcomed the technology without realizing they were also embracing dependency on China's digital framework. Every nation that adopted the system became part of a growing economic constellation orbiting Beijing. It was a network of trade, trust, and quiet control where influence flowed through circuits instead of treaties. The digital yuan was not only challenging the dollar, it was redefining what it meant to hold currency in the 21st century. As America struggled to modernize its own financial systems, weighed down by bureaucracy and complacency, China moved with purpose. It had learned that in the new era, the winner would not be the nation with the strongest army or the most wealth, but the one with the smartest system. By merging technology and finance, China blurred the boundaries between economics and governance, creating a model that others could only watch and wonder. The birth of the digital yuan marked the beginning of a new chapter in the story of money. One written, not on paper or metal, but in lines of code and vision of control. De-dollarization began not with grand announcements but with subtle decisions made behind closed doors in boardrooms, ministries, and central banks. For decades, the US dollar had been the anchor of international trade, the unit in which oil was priced, and the reserve currency of almost every major economy. It was the thread that stitched the global financial fabric together. Yet, beneath the surface, nations had grown wary of its dominance. Each sanction, each act of financial coercion by the United States planted a seed of quiet defiance. Countries began to see the dollar not as a neutral medium of exchange but as a tool of control, a lever used to reward allies and punish dissenters. China, patient and perceptive, understood that resentment could be transformed into resistance, and resistance into revolution. The process of de-dollarization was never meant to be dramatic. It was designed to be deliberate. China began forging bilateral agreements that bypassed the dollar altogether. Trade with Russia, Iran, and parts of Africa shifted to local currencies or to the yuan. Each of these deals, small in isolation, collectively eroded the dollar's omnipresence. Central banks started holding more gold, reducing their dependency on U.S. treasuries. Regional payment systems were developed to replace SWIFT, insulating nations from American oversight. The machinery of global finance was slowly being rewired, and China was one of the key engineers. It was not confrontation, it was construction, an alternative order taking shape under the old one. China's strategy was not to destroy the dollar, but to make it optional. By creating multiple avenues of trade settlement, it gave nations the freedom to choose, a freedom that, Paradoxically, the dollar-dominated world had denied them. The rise of the yuan in international trade was carefully nurtured through diplomacy and development. The Belt and Road Initiative became a vehicle for financial expansion. Loans, contracts, and infrastructure investments were increasingly denominated in Chinese currency, binding recipients not just through debt, but through dependence on China's financial ecosystem. The more projects it financed, the more global commerce began to orbit around the yuan. Meanwhile, the United States grew complacent. Its leaders assumed the dollar's supremacy was eternal, sustained by history and habit, yet habits can change when necessity demands it. The global financial crises, the waves of sanctions, and the rising costs of borrowing all chipped away at the trust once placed in the dollar. Nations realized that the same system which had promised stability could also deliver vulnerability. When America froze billions in foreign reserves during geopolitical disputes, it sent a clear message. Assets held in dollars were not truly sovereign. China, observing closely, offered an alternative: trade in a currency untainted by such risks, a system unburdened by political interference. The momentum gathered slowly but unmistakably. Saudi Arabia began exploring oil sales in yuan, signaling the possible end of the petrodollar era. Russia shifted its reserves and trade settlements, aligning more deeply with China's vision of financial autonomy. Southeast Asian nations experimented with local currency swaps. Even in Europe, quiet conversations began about diversification. What was once unthinkable, a world trading without the dollar, was becoming imaginable. China's diplomatic hand guided much of this transition, always under the guise of cooperation, never confrontation. It presented dollarization not as rebellion, but as reform. At the heart of this movement lay a profound psychological shift. The dollar, long seen as the unquestioned pillar of trust, began to appear fragile. The myth of its permanence cracked as nations realized that dependence meant exposure. China's alternative gained appeal not just because it offered efficiency, but because it promised dignity, the ability to transact, trade, and thrive without submission to another's control. Through patience and persistence, de-dollarization evolved from an idea into a movement, a quiet revolution carried out not with slogans or protests, but with policies, partnerships, and the relentless passage of time. Trade wars and currency manipulation became the new battlegrounds of modern empires, waged not with weapons of destruction, but with instruments of deception. Tariffs replaced troops, sanctions replaced sieges, and exchange rates became the artillery of global competition. In this silent struggle, the United States and China stood as the two commanding powers, each wielding economic tools to bend the world's supply chains, influence markets, and shape destinies. The trade war that erupted between them was never just about goods or deficits. It was about control, about who would write the rules of the future economy. For China, every confrontation was a lesson, every sanction a signal, every fluctuation in currency a message written in invisible ink. China understood early that in the theater of global trade, perception is as powerful as policy. By allowing its currency to rise or fall strategically, it could cushion its industries, attract investors, or destabilize competitors, all without firing a single shot. The West labeled this manipulation. But for China, it was calibration. The yuan became both shield and sword, defending domestic growth while piercing the fragile confidence of foreign markets. When America raised tariffs, China countered not only with its own but with currency adjustments so precise they resembled the movements of a skilled chess player, anticipating each move several steps ahead. The battlefield was not physical, yet the consequences were tangible. Factories closed, prices surged, and markets trembled under the weight of uncertainty. Behind this financial warfare lay two contrasting philosophies. America's strategy was reactionary, rooted in short-term politics and the defense of its existing order. China's, by contrast, was evolutionary, long-term, systemic, and patient. It did not seek immediate victory but gradual realignment. Each policy, each shift in exchange rate, each trade negotiation served a larger design to reposition China at the center of global commerce. When Washington imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, it underestimated the depth of China's industrial resilience and the reach of its alliances. Factories adapted, exports rerouted, and new markets emerged across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The very barriers America erected became walls of opportunity for China to expand elsewhere. Currency manipulation was never about numbers alone. It was about narrative. When investors lost faith in the stability of the dollar or the fairness of American trade policy, China stepped forward as the voice of predictability. It presented itself as a stable partner, a country that played the long game in a volatile world. Its central bank operated with quiet discipline, adjusting the yuan not in panic but in purpose. Every decision carried layers of strategy, balancing domestic growth, protecting employment, and signaling to the global community that China could weather any economic storm. The message was subtle yet unmistakable. While others reacted, China planned. The trade war exposed the limits of American leverage. For years, the United States had believed that its market size and dollar dominance gave it absolute power. But as tariffs escalated, it discovered that globalization had woven economies too tightly for unilateral control. American companies depended on Chinese supply chains. Consumers relied on Chinese goods, and investors feared the volatility that conflict brought. China exploited this interdependence with precision. It used selective retaliation, targeting sectors that would exert political pressure in Washington while protecting its own growth engines. It knew that in a world connected by commerce, economic pain could be redirected rather than endured. Through the turbulence, China's strategy remained consistent: endure, adapt, and outlast. Its leaders viewed trade wars not as crises, but as catalysts, opportunities to accelerate self-sufficiency in technology, manufacturing, and finance. By turning external pressure into internal reform, China transformed weakness into weaponry. Each round of sanctions or tariff threats reinforced its resolve to detach from the dollar-centric order. The more America tried to constrain it through economic might, the more China learned to thrive without it. In the grand theater of trade and currency warfare, China did not merely play defense. It rewrote the rules of engagement, proving that in the modern world, control over money and markets could achieve what military might once did.